Okay, wow. I just want to say how amazing it is to see this packed crowd. I mean, this is really, really amazing. So my name is Karen Jameson, and I'm the Senior Manager of Trailhead Content Engineering for Salesforce. Very excited to be here with all of my amazing, awesome admins who either code or want to code, or are supporting admins who code. I also, in 2015, I co-founded Rad Women. Any Rad Women in the crowd? Woo! Yeah, go Rad Women. So Rad Women is a coding school for free coding, 10-week coding school for women who are advanced Salesforce admins wanting to learn to code on the platform. So advanced means you've been doing admin for a couple of years. And I also blog admin-focused developer content at Women Code Heroes. So before we get started, please make your purchasing decisions based on what is currently available in the platform. Okay, so why are you here? Well, maybe you're here for the same reasons that I wanted to learn to code, and that is there was this big black box in the middle of my org, and I understood all the other stuff, but then there was this mystery in the middle of the org, and when something went wrong, I couldn't figure out what was causing it, and I just had this feeling, well, maybe it's in the black box. Sometimes it was me, but I wanted to know what was in there, and you know, I never really wanted to be a full-time coder, and maybe that's you, and that's great, and I love you, and I want to talk to you afterwards. But maybe you're like me, and you just want to know what it is in there so that you can read it and troubleshoot and be able to more effectively talk to your developers. So this is why this session is here, to kind of demystify some of the code that comes along with triggers. Hopefully everybody's in the right place. So what is an ITEX trigger? An ITEX trigger is basically just a file that contains some code. Best practices say that code there's one trigger per object, and it's listening to that object, and it's waiting for database events to happen. So that is anytime something is inserted or updated or deleted or maybe undeleted, because you can do that too. And when that happens, it knows what it's listening to, and it knows what to do. Oh, you just inserted an account record? Oh, I know what to do. I'm going to send off to these other files filled with code and do things. And then it's just going to sit back and wait for the next database. So it's just a file with code in it. And what are the use cases? So we all know that we have an amazing display of declarative tools, process builder, flow, you know, all the things that we use every day. So why would you use triggers? Well, there's some times when a trigger will allow you to do some things that you can't quite yet do with process builder. Who knows? Maybe we'll get there. But it allows you to compare data before you make a change and after you make a change, and depending on what those changes are, then you can set off a whole bunch of actions. It also allows you to create new and update existing records that are related to whatever records that you're changing, or even work with unrelated records. So maybe you have this log. Every time you make a change to certain databases, you want to have a log, a custom log that sends off and creates records in this log. So that's just one example. You can delete records, so it can help you clean up your data. And you can interact with external data systems. So maybe you have external systems that aren't in Salesforce. You have an ERP, you have a financial system, you have all of these things that you can interact with through a trigger. And it can allow you to do things like send off text messages, and there's all of these other web services out there that you can use, that you can interact with a trigger. And they also work really well, or classes work really well, with Process Builder, because you can hook into code using Process Builder as well. So those are some of the things that triggers can do. When do they fire? So you have separate sections of your trigger, and the best practice is that you only have one trigger per object, so only one file that's listening for things to happen. That is the traffic, director. And it is looking for what do you want me to do before that record is saved or committed to the database, or what do you want me to do after? So the before kind of actions you can do is you can work with data and change that data programmatically before you save it to the database. You can make sure you're validating in more complex ways than you can do with validation rules. So you can go beyond what you can do with validation rules and do some very complex validations to make sure that the data that's being saved isn't going to mess anything up. So maybe that data is in an external system and you can't get at that with a validation rule. And I'll have a use case later on for that. So then there are after triggers. So after the data is saved, you can do a whole bunch of stuff as well. So that's work with the records, related records related to the record that you just saved or deleted or whatever you did. And you can create and update existing records. So I'm a very visual person, so this is, for those of us who are visual learners, this is the visual. So imagine you made a change to an account record. And the account, there's a trigger that's associated with that account record, and it's listening, and it just saw that you inserted a new account. And it is going to look within it, it's going to have a section that says, before save, this is what I want to do. This is the before trigger, or before insert in this case. And it's going to link to various other files that contain code that will do all the things. It will validate the data and compare the values and then change stuff. And then you'll save your data. And then all of the after actions will happen. So that also is a trigger that, it's part of the trigger that links off to other files called classes that have code. And that's creating related records, finding related records based on whatever records that you just changed, and so forth. And then it just sits back and waits for the next database event to happen. So this is the basic structure of a trigger. First of all, you're going to say what the trigger is, that it is a trigger. Then you're going to name the trigger. So you're going to give it a name. And then you're going to say what object is it listening to. And then in these parentheses, you're going to say when do you want it to run? Before, after, before insert, before update, that sort of stuff. So you're basically telling it when you want it to do this piece of code. And the piece of code that you want it to do is in between the parentheses here. So let's look at a more filled-in example. And this is one that we're going to use later on in a demo. So we have trigger. The trigger is called recipe. It's listening to the recipe custom objects. And it's going to work after insert and after update. So after the data is saved for this recipe is saved, it's going to do something. There are other options. So the before actions can happen on before insert, before update, and before delete. After actions can happen after insert, after update, after delete, and after undelete. So you can imagine, this opens up a whole bunch of things. Like when someone restores a record, maybe you want to do something different, that you can't, they can't really do declaratively. So we talked about one place where all of this code lives, and that is we have a trigger, and it's going to link off to other files called classes that are going to contain the code that does all the things. There is another way you can do it. And I'm going to tell you, who here is working with a developer right now? Okay, great. So I would love for all of you to go back and look at your org and see if you can spot any of these things that aren't quite right. I mean, I'm sure you're working with brilliant people, and they are not going to do any of these things, but just in case. So this is one of the not so good common practices, and that is to put all the code within the trigger itself. So you have, and it seems simple, right? You have one trigger per object, and you have one trigger, and it has all the stuff in it that does all the things. It seems simple, right? Well, why wouldn't you do that? You wouldn't do it because of a few reasons. One is, if you're going to imagine you have something and you want an event to happen, you want some update to happen before insert and before update, but also in those sections, there are specific things that you only want to happen before insert and not in the before update. So there's certain things that are the same in these two kind of criterias, but then there's other things that are not. If you had all your code in one trigger, then you would have to repeat the code that does the thing that's common to those things multiple times, which it's not good. It's not good because if you maintain it, you have to make sure that you're updating it in both places. It's hard to manage. and you're having to sift through all of that code and re-understand. Whereas if you have your trigger and it just links out to each of these sections, it becomes like a recipe, a menu of things. Okay, before insert, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Like even before you go into the code to see really what that entails, you already have a list of the things that this trigger is doing. So it's great. It's almost your instruction manual for this trigger. The other thing is it's much easier to understand if you've got more atomic, smaller pieces of code that do one thing instead of all the things. It's much easier to understand. And you may have heard about unit tests. So unit tests are code that you write or the developer writes to make sure that your code is doing what you want it to do and not doing something else. And beyond that, when you're coding over here and doing additional functionality, you run all your unit tests and make sure that they still work. And not causing what's called a regression, which is something that used to work that no longer works because you changed something over here. So it's much easier to write these unit tests if you've got distinct code that does one thing, and then it's much easier to understand. And at the bonus, why do you want one trigger per object? And that's because if you have 2 triggers or 3 triggers that are listening to a single object, you can't actually control when they fire. So maybe you have trigger A and trigger B, and sometimes trigger A fires first, and sometimes trigger B fires first. It's not going to even be the same. Within, the next time someone inserts something, B could be first. Next time somebody inserts, A could be first. So if you have one trigger, then you can control the order that things are going to happen. Okay. That's a lot of talk about theory. Let's look at how we're going to set up this demo. So we're going to have a cooking with code, which is my thing that I do. I love talking about cooking. I love cooking and eating and all of that stuff. So I have a custom app, and it has 2 custom objects in it. One is a recipe object, and the recipes each can have multiple reviews. And that review has a single reviewer that is tied to the user's object. So that's the setup. So what do I want this trigger to do? I have old recipes in there that don't have reviews. I've just decided that I'm going to do this review object, and I'm like, oh, this is great. So what I want the trigger to do is after any record, any recipe is inserted or updated into my database, I want it to look at those and say, oh, does it have a review? If it does have a review, do nothing. If it doesn't have a review, then I want to create a review, and I want to create it based on some of the data that relates to this recipe. So it's going to be a stub record. It's going to be assigned to somebody, have a due date, and exist. And then it's just going to save all those records back up to the org. So again, for those who are visual like me, let's imagine that we're inserting, using data loader or something like that, 1,000 new and updated records, new recipes, updated recipes, and we're sending them all at once. And they are going to go into the trigger. So the trigger is listening. It's like, oh, you just sent me a whole bunch of files, records, great. And it's going to stick them in a thing called a list. Now, a list is just a container that stores groups of things, like a bucket. So imagine we have a bucket and it's filled with all of these 1,000 recipes. And it's going to, and within that trigger, it's got its laundry list of, okay, do this, and then do this, and then do this. So it's going to send that to a method within a class. So we talked about a class. Class is just another container, a file to store code. Within that class, there are methods. And methods are just sections of that class that do the things. So actually all of the things that your code is going to do are within a thing called a method. So it's going to fire off to the method, and it's going to send all of those new recipes. They're in a list called trigger.new, and that's just there for you. It's already built into the trigger. You don't have to create anything. So it's actually quite easy to use. And you send them to the method within the class, and it's going to go into a new bucket. And you might be thinking, why are there all these buckets? There's a lot of buckets. But the reason why is because the class itself can accept that bucket of new recipes, the trigger.new, but it can't actually use it until it puts it in its own bucket. So it's like, okay, just pour the bucket from trigger.new and pour those recipes into list recipes. So that's all of the 1,000 recipes that we just inserted and updated. And then we're going to use a thing called a loop, which is great. It's a coding functionality that allows you to take out a recipe one at a time and look at it and then do something with it. And in our case, we're going to look at the recipe and see if it has a review. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, we're going to create one. And then that review that we create is going to go into a third bucket. Again, lots of buckets. Why do we have this other bucket? Because each bucket, each list, can only store a single type of record. So in this case, it's going to store all of the reviews that we're creating. And why are we putting this in a bucket? Why aren't we saving these records one at a time, these 1,000 records one at a time? We could just send them up to the database. Anybody? No? No? Governor limits. I don't know who said that, but yes, governor limits. And the governor limits are a way that Salesforce kind of controls all the tenants in this massive apartment building of the cloud that they have for each instance of your Salesforce org. Imagine if you're in there in this massive apartment building and there's one tenant and they're using up all the hot water. And so everybody else has cold showers. Not good. So cold showers in our case are delayed response in your org, maybe a 500 error or a timeout error. So in order to control that, we have a thing called governor limits. And governor limits say you can't send 1,000 records up to the database all at once. I'm just going to stop you from doing it. So Salesforce makes us be efficient in our code. And that's called bulkification. It's bulking all of these records together in a single list. And then we're going to just take that bucket, that list, and send it up all at once to our database. So that's what we do with DML. DML, it stands for Data Manipulation Language. And it is a really fancy name for a very simple concept. When we look at it later, you probably will laugh like I did when I first saw it, because all it is insert this thing, update this thing. And in this case, it's going to be insert new reviews. Okay, demo time. Enough slides. Let's get into the actual stuff. Great. So here I have, let me just make sure that you can all see it. Is that big enough? Cool. So here's my Cooking with Code custom app. It has recipes, reviews, and the people are the reviewers. That's the user object. And we're going to look at coconut ice, one of my favorite desserts when I was a kid. I'm surprised I have any teeth left because it's really sugary. And it has a recipe name, and a category, and cooking time, and all this kind of stuff. And it has a roll-up summary field to a related record. It's a master detail relationship between the recipe and the review. And it's counting how many reviews we have. If I go into related, you'll see there are 4 reviews. That's good. It's counting correctly. And if I go into the review, you can see that it's got a title, it's related to the recipe object, it's got a review, there's a due date, there's a person who is reviewing this, there's a status, and a rating. Cool. Well, this is pretty, we could do this in our sleep, right? So let's look at what the code looks like. So one of the really great things about Salesforce is that you don't have to, unlike other programming languages where you have to have your computer set up in a particular way with certain software, Salesforce allows you to just do everything within the cloud if you want to. And I recommend this way because this is like the lowest barrier to entry for us as admins. We don't have to install anything, it's just there. So it's underneath the gear icon, and I'm going to click on Developer Console. Great. So this is our trigger. Super simple. It's a trigger called recipe, and it's listening to the recipe object. It is going to work after insert and after update. So anytime anything is inserted or updated in the database. And then what's it going to do? It's going to go out to this class, the recipe utility class, which again, class is just a file that contains code. And it's going to look for the section of the code, the method called create review, and it's going to send it all of the records, the 1,000 records that we just sent up to Salesforce. So just by this, you can kind of see, well, what does this do? It's plain English, isn't it? I mean, you can read it and say, this is another thing you should check to make sure that your developers are doing, or you do in the future, hopefully. is that you name your methods and your classes and your triggers so that you can really understand, without even going into it, what it does. This creates a review. Pretty easy. Okay, so let's look at where the code really lives, and that's in our class. So I'm just going to open the class, the recipe. So again, it's recipe utility. I'm going to the recipe utility class, and let's walk through this. Make this a bit bigger. So we're saying public just is a way of saying any code within my org can reach into this class and look at the contents of it and work with it. So it is a class, again, just a type of file, and it's called recipe utility. Again, it's right in the trigger, it's just sending it to them. Anything that has these 2 forward slashes, it is a code comment. So that's my way of saying to myself, what does this do? So I kind of over-comment because I have gone back after a year and tried to figure out what I did, and it's like, oh, it's really frustrating if I can't remember what I did. So I go in and I probably over-comment, but I like it. It's my way. But you should see comments. If you don't see any comments in your code, then talk to whoever created it and say, I would like you to tell me what this does. And this, again, is a great way for you to troubleshoot because, hey, it's saying what it does, and you can say, oh, I think there might be a problem in this little piece here. So this is the method. So we're looking at the create review method. This is what's going to do everything. Again, it's a public method, so it's available to any code within my org. Don't worry about the static part. Void just means that it's going to do its thing, and it's not going to send anything back to the trigger. So it's going to create the review and move on, but it's not sending anything back to the trigger to do anything else. It could. It could send something back to the trigger, and then some other class or method could fire, when we have a cascade of actions. But in this case, it doesn't. And then what it's doing is it's taking that trigger.new list and it's going to stick it in a new list that it can use. Again, it can't use trigger.new. That's outside of the class. We need something inside the class. So we're creating a list. It's going to store, oops, don't want to move it. It's going to store recipe objects, and it's called list recipe. Cool. So next we're going to create a variable. And a variable is sort of like a temporary storage container. It just temporarily stores something so that you can use it within your method. In this case, it's a date variable. It's going to store the due date. So ddate stands for due date. I could call this Bob, but I like to use things that I will remember what it is. So ddate stands for due date. And actually, I should probably say due date here. And it's going to create a date. So this is some built-in functions, just like all of the functions that we use every day in validation rules or formula fields. There are formulas that we can use within the code. And in this case, there's a whole bunch of stuff related to date. And so this one today is going to set the due date to today. And then it's going to override it. So we're taking the value. So ddate currently is, for example, September 27th. And so ddate is now going to be overwritten and say, okay, add 1 month to ddate. So you can read that. I mean, hopefully this makes sense to you, that you can actually read it. Now, you might not be able to code it straight away. You might have to have your cheat sheet, but this is great to be able to go in and have a look at your code and just to see what it does. Reading it is the first step. So then what are we doing? We're creating a list that's going to contain all of the new reviews. So it's a list. It's storing reviews. It's called new review. Don't worry too much about this. This is all very formulaic. But it's just creating a blank, empty new list. And then this is our loop. So everything between this curly brace and the end curly brace is what we're going to do with each recipe. So we're going to take the recipe out, we're going to do something with it, and then we're going to put it to the side. And every time, we're going to go back into the bucket, into the list, and see if there's another recipe. And if there is, we do something with it. If it's not, then we're done with our loop, and we move on with everything else in the method. So what's our loop doing? Anybody here used a formula field with an if statement in it? Yep. Great. This is like that. So it's asking a question. If in the recipe object, or the recipe record, if the number of reviews is less than 1, i.e. none, there's no reviews, then do something. And everything that do something is between these curly braces. So curly braces are sort of like the beginning and the end for each section of code, for the most part. And what are we going to do? We're going to create a new review. So I'm creating, again, a temporary variable, a temporary storage called my review. And it is a review. And inside these parentheses is what the values, they're the values for the review record. So we have a name, and we're going to concatenate, which means just stick together, two strings. A string is just text. And it's going to say review of, and it's going to add on the name of the review. So if the recipe was, coconut ice, then it would say review of coconut ice. The status is going to be set to not started. We're using our date variable that we created above for our due date. Then we're associating the review with the recipe. So whatever recipe we're looking at, that's the ID that we're going to use to relate things. And we're setting the reviewer to whoever owns the review. We could do all manner of things here, but that's what we're doing here. And then, so we have this review called my review. It's just, I'm holding it in my review bucket or variable. And I'm going to add it to the list that we have that stores all of the new reviews. And this is the thing, so as we go through and loop through each of the recipes, this is the bucket, the list that's going to hold all of my new reviews. And just wait. It hasn't done anything with them yet. They're not in the database yet. They're just inside my class, just waiting to do something. And then I'm done with my if statement, which is, if there is no reviews, then do something. I'm done with all of the recipes in my bucket, so the end of the loop. And then this is DML. This is it. This is the magic of saving to the database. Insert new reviews. So this list just gets sent up to the database. And then that's the end of my method and the end of my class, right? So you can read this. It may take you a while to figure out, and part of coding is learning what you can ignore. This is very formulaic. It's just what you do. I could make a list contain some contents of some other list. So that's why, we have to say what it does. But this basically just means it's new, it's blank. So, little pop quiz. If I wanted to change my, let me scroll down a little bit. If I wanted to change my criteria for when a review was created to say, well, I actually need, if it's a difficult recipe, then I need 3 reviews. What lines would I change in this? Yep, 19, exactly. Well done, you're all coders. Easy as that. And if I wanted to change, actually, I'm not going to hint too much, but if I wanted to change the values that the new review was going to hold, what lines would where would I put that? Yep, exactly. So it's in between here. So maybe I want to not set this to the recipe owner. Maybe I want to go out and say, I don't know if this person is on time off. Maybe they're on vacation. Let's go out to some external system and figure out who actually is available. Or maybe this person has too many reviews. So this is where you could up above, you could do another kind of part of this that goes out and finds the right person to set as the reviewer and put it in there. So let's see this in action. I mean, this is great, but the magic is in the actual doing. So I'm going to create a new recipe called Fog City Fudge, because it's foggy today. And it's a dessert. Cooking time is 1/4 of an hour. Preparation time is 1/2 an hour. And I'm going to send Dita, she's one of my best recipe finders. She created this, and it's going to be easy. So obviously, this is a new recipe. It's got no reviews on it because it doesn't exist. Let's see what happens. Boom. 1 review. And if we go in here, you see that it says review of Fog City Fudge. It's tied to the Fog City Fudge recipe. It's got a due date of a month from today. It's assigned to me because I own that record. And it's not started. what happens, and I kind of alluded to unit tests. This would be one of the unit tests that we would write. In code, we would say, create a new recipe, and I expect there to be one review in it, and it should have these values. So that's a unit test. We're going to do another unit test. We would do it programmatically, but this coconut ice, actually, we'll do hot cross buns, because I love hot cross buns. It has one review, so we would expect it not to create a review if we edit it. So let's edit it and change this to medium and save it. So it's got one review. We expect there to be one review, and there is, just one review. Review of hot cross buns. So then the other thing we would expect is if we edit something that doesn't have a review, we would expect it to have a review, to create a new review. So let's edit this, and this would be my third unit test, for example. And let's put in a cooking time. I don't know. Can't remember how long it takes to cook these. Let's just save that. Boom, a review. So you might ask, so that's it. Yay! Yay, code. So you might ask, why would I not just do this with Process Builder? Obviously, you could do this with Process Builder, right? Obviously. But what about the use cases I said as well? Like, what if you want to have a more complicated system of looking at the reviewers and say, well, if this is a difficult recipe, then I'm not going to give it to, Karen. She can't handle difficult recipes. I'm going to give it to, Sandita, because she really knows her stuff. Or what if you want to do that PTO schedule? Those are the types of things that you would want to do with code, because you just can't really do that with Process Builder. Or you could do most of this with Process Builder and then have the timeout schedule call out to a class and do it. So there are times when you want to use this. But definitely, if you can do Process Builder, do Process Builder. I just want to say that. So, let me get back to the presentation. It's so small I can't see it. So let's sum up. What did we learn? Triggers and classes, they're just files. They contain code. And the triggers point to classes, which are going to contain all the code. Your triggers are more like the recipe of what you're going to do, or the ingredients list, or sections. My analogy is breaking down before your eyes. But classes contain methods that are just sections of the class that do individual things. Your class could have 4 or 5 different methods in it, as many as you want. That triggers can work on records before you save them, before you commit them to the database, or afterwards. And there's different things that they do really well on either side. We learned about variables. They're just temporary storage containers that contain things just for the life of the method or the class. And then the lists are a type of variable. They store things temporarily, and but they are kind of like a bucket, and they contain lots of things. And we can work on them as a group. And that loops are a built-in kind of coding functionality that allows you to take something out of a list, do something, you evaluate it, do something with it, and then go on to the next one. Lots of really good built-in functionality there. And that the best practices for triggers are to have one trigger per object so that you can control the order that all of these actions are happening in. And that to put all your code that does a thing in a class, not within the actual trigger itself. And don't be a bad tenant. Don't use up all the water. Bulkify your code. If you're going to, you want to make sure that when you go back, that you see that pattern in your code, in your org. So you love this. You want a taste of more. I recommend Trailhead. I'll show you some stuff in the meantime. Also, these slides and this presentation will go up on the session notes. So within the events app, so I'll post those later today and whenever the recording is available. 2 websites, of course I have to plug mine, Women Code Heroes. If you liked this, there's lots of this type of stuff, analogies and easy to understand, kind of hopefully easy to understand concepts at womencodeheroes.com. All are welcome. And sfdc99.com is another great, David Liu created that. Lots of things. If you're a woman and you've been on the platform for more than 2 years and you want to be part of Rad Women, we run sessions twice a year. It's free. Come talk to me afterwards. Happy to help out. So these are the Trailhead badges that I recommend. including a quick start that's getting hands-on as admins, Apex coding for admins. Oops, should I go back? I'll go back. I'll ask questions and go back. So, questions? Okay.
What can triggers do that flows cannot?
What can triggers do that flows cannot? Flows are really powerful. They can absolutely do a lot. But there's certain things that they can't do. Like go out to external services and if you have really complex, well, not even really complex, you'll hit your head against a certain level. I mean, my advice is to do everything declaratively until you can't. And that's when you know. Yep.
I've been working with Flow, and I know that when you do like a fast query or a fast lookup, and you can pull in fields to work with them and criteria.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put the object data into the list, you can auto pull in all of the data, because I saw you had criteria within your loop, but you weren't querying a sample, so.
I had criteria in my loop because the trigger was sending all of those records. So I didn't have to search the database. These records they don't exist. Some of them don't exist in the database yet. Yeah, so when trigger.new has the entire contents of that record that you're updating.
I'm new to ITEX, so I just noticed you instantiated
Sorry, I'm having a hard, maybe you can go up to the mic. I'm having a hard time hearing.
Hello? Yeah, this works.
I'll answer a question in the meantime. Yeah?
So I noticed that yours was triggered by somebody making an edit or creating a new record. Is there a way to use the triggers to run on the system, sort of like on a...
You can do scheduled classes that run on a schedule. So yeah, there is a way of doing that.
Do you do that as a trigger or as a class?
It's not a trigger. It would be a class that you would set up as a, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. You can, as you saw in this, it is going cross-object. So it's, you're doing something on a recipe, and it's doing something with the review. So the trigger can work with any of the objects in your org. One trigger per object, but within that object, within that trigger, it can fire off a method or go to a class and look at a method that is looking at other, anything, that you need. Sorry, triggers work off API. That actually I don't know. Let's look that up afterwards. I don't know. Oh, why don't you go first?
I was just going to say, I'm a pretty new admin, so maybe this is a dumb question. But
no dumb questions.
I just looked into my org, and we have a bunch of triggers on the op object.
Yep.
And I know that a lot of them come from managed packages.
So yes.
When does, Discover org has like 3 by itself.
Yeah, that's tricky. With managed packages, sometimes you can see that stuff and sometimes you can't. So that's tricky. Yeah. I don't know what else to say. It's tricky.
So you mentioned that triggers can be used to interact with external sources. How would you do that within the trigger?
You call out to, I can show you some example code afterwards, but yeah, you call out to it, and you're just like in the, oh, no, I can't. Yeah, we're out of time. Let's talk afterwards, because I am happy to show them. Thank you all.